The next JSP web application we're going to create is a little more complex than the date web application. It's actually going to have two JSP pages. One is going to contain a form that we're going to input data into. Then we're going to submit that form to another JSP page. It's going to get the data and it's going to display it in tabular fashion. Okay, so two JSP pages, they're going to be interacting with one another. They're going to be sharing data, okay, with one another. So within NetBeans, let's go up to the File drop-down option, select New Project. Make sure Java Web is selected underneath of Categories and Web Application underneath of Projects. Push Next. Give the web application a name. We're going to call it Forms Web Application. Push Next. Push Next again, and then Finish. Okay, and there's our web application project, Forms Web Application. And there is the index.html file, which we're going to delete in just a few moments because we're not creating HTML pages, we're creating JSP pages. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to select the project, do a right click, and we're going to add a new JSP. Now, if you've already added JSP pages to a web application project, then when you do the right clicks, you should see the JSP listed, okay, within the pop-up, okay, after New. If you don't see it, select Other, okay, and then underneath of Category, select Web, and underneath of File Type, select JSP. But if you've already gone through that process of adding a JSP to at least one web application project, then when you select another web application project, do a right click, select New. You should see it listed there for you. Okay, so you can select it from within the pop-up. You want to name it. I'm going to name it Index. Push on Finish. And there's our JSP page. Okay, and at this point I'm going to delete the HTML page. Okay, so some changes I'm going to make to this index.jsp, which, by the way, this index.jsp is going to be the JSP that contains our form. And it's going to have some fields like text fields and drop-down selections and whatnot, buttons. You know, this JSP is going to contain all HTML. It's going to contain our form. It's going to contain all HTML. It's not going to contain any Java code. But I always like to change the contents of the title and the heading 1 element so that it sort of explains what we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to say using forms. Okay, that's going to be the title and the heading for this JSP page. Okay, but then below that heading 1 element, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a form. Now, NetBeans makes it easy for us to add forms and tables and text fields and buttons and whatnot to our JSP pages because it offers us this palette. Okay, on the right-hand side of the IDE, you should see a palette. If you don't panic. You can open it up underneath of the window drop-down option. There's an option for IDE tools, and if you select that, then there's an option for palette. If you push that, it should pop up this palette. And the palette has 5 different areas that can open and close. One for HTML forms, another for HTML. There's one for JSP, one for JSF, and one for database. We're really only going to be using the HTML and HTML forms components of the palette. But what's really cool is this palette, you know, offers different buttons that we can push to drag HTML into our JSP, automatically generated HTML. Okay, so for example, for a form, underneath of HTML forms, there's a button for form. Okay, which if you push your cursor, put your cursor over it, you can see the HTML that's going to be generated for the form. Well, you do a left click on the button and hold that down. Hold the left button down, and then drag your cursor over into your JSP page where you want your form to be displayed. And then let go of the left mouse button. Pop-up window appears. You have to input some information into this window. You have to specify the action of the form, and what that means is you have to specify the JSP page that this form is going to call when the submit button is pushed. And we're going to have a JSP page called display.jsp that's going to get called when the form on this page is submitted. You have to specify the method, okay, that you want the action to be undertaken, and we want to use the post method. We're always going to use the post method. And then you have to give the form a name. I'm going to name the form my form. And I push on OK. and there I have the HTML generated for me for the form, okay, which is pretty cool. So now what I want to do to this form is I want to add four text fields to input data. I want to add a drop-down selection list to select data, and I want to add 2 buttons, okay. I always like to include those text fields and drop-down selection lists and whatnot inside of a table, okay, because it makes it look a little bit neater. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a table, an HTML table, over into my JSP. So I'm going to push the table button. I'm going to do a left click, drag over inside of the form, and I'm going to drop a table. And I want the table to have 5 rows. So I could change that to 4 or 3 or 6, but I want it to have 5 rows. I want it to have 2 columns, and I don't want it to have any border. So I'm going to decrease the border size to 0. And there's my table generated for me. Okay, this is the HTML for a table. Okay. I always get rid of, you just saw me remove the table heading element. And let me do that again. I probably did that too quickly. I apologize. Let me remove the table and let me do that again. I'm going to drag a table over inside of the form. It's going to have 5 rows, 2 columns, and no border. Push on OK. And NetBeans generates a table for me. It includes a table header element in the table, which I never use. I delete it. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select it and I'm going to delete it. Just my personal preference. You could use it if you wanted to. I don't like to use it. I am going to use the table body though. And what I'm going to do in each one of the rows of the table body is I'm going to insert either a text field or a drop-down selection list. And inside of the first row, I'm going to have a input box, a text input for the first name. So in the palette underneath of HTML forms, there's a button for text input. I'm going to left click it and drag it over into the table. Okay, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it first. I'm not going to give it any initial value. Its type is text, and I'm going to specify that it have a width of 50. In the second row, I'm going to do a very similar thing for the last name. I'm going to drag a text input, okay, into the table, into the second row, that I'm going to call last. And I'm going to specify that it have a width of 50 as well. In the third row of the table, I'm going to input the user's email address. So I have a heading for email address, and then I'm going to drag another text input, okay, into the table, okay, to gather that information. I'm going to name it email, and it's going to have a width of 50 as well. Now in my fourth row, I'm going to gather the gender. I'm going to input the gender from the user, and I'm actually going to use a drop-down selection list for that. So I'm going to drag a drop-down selection HTML element into my table. It's going to have 2 options, one for male and one for female, but only one of those is going to be visible. Okay, I could change that if I wanted to 3 or 4, but I only want 2 options, and one will be visible. Okay, and there's my drop-down selection list. The first option is going to display male. Second option is going to display female. And in the last row of my table, I'm going to input the date of birth. And for that, I'm going to have another text input. This text input is going to be a little bit smaller. I'm going to name it DOB. It's only going to have a width of 15, but it's also going to have an initial value of month, day, year. Okay. So the only thing at this point that's missing from the form is a submit button to submit the data on the form, but also I always like to add a clear button so that I can clear the data that's input into the text field. So I'm going to drag a button over into the form, and the first one is going to be labeled clear. It's going to be a reset button. I'm going to name it clear. The label is actually what gets displayed on the button. Okay. And then I'm going to drag a submit button over into the form, okay, which is going to be labeled submit. It's going to be a submit button, and its name is going to be submit. And there's my form. All HTML, no JSP yet, all HTML. Okay, so I'm going to compile the JSP, and then I'm going to run it. And we'll take a look at it. It's really not going to do anything, okay, yet. Okay, I can input data into it if I want to. Okay, I can input a name and an address, select a gender, input a date of birth. But I can't really do anything with that data because when I submit the form, I'm going to get an error. Right? And the reason why I'm getting an error is because, if you remember, I'm going to go back into NetBeans, the action that this form is going to take when it gets submitted is it's going to post data to this display.jsp. Well, the display.jsp has never been created. It doesn't exist yet. So when I try to submit to it, when I try to post data to it, I get an error. Okay, and you can see that in the browser. Okay, I get an error. So what that tells me is I have to implement that display.jsp. Remember, I told you this web application is going to have 2 JSP pages. We're done the first one, the index, but now we have to implement the display.jsp. So we're going to add another JSP, okay, to the application. We have to make sure it's named display, okay, because that's what we're going to be posting to on the submit of the form. So we're going to name it display, just display. NetBeans will put the .jsp extension on for us. Okay, but here's our display.jsp now. Okay, and I'm going to give this display.jsp the same title and the same heading 1 as we had in the previous JSP. Now this JSP is going to contain Java code. Okay, it's going to contain a mixture of Java code and HTML. And I'm going to start off underneath the heading 1 element. I'm going to start off with the Java code. So I have to include my start tag and end tag for my JSP element, which I have. Okay, but then within the Java code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the parameters that are passed in the request to this page. I'm going to get the parameter values. And by the way, when they get passed to this page, they're going to get passed as strings. Anything that gets input into a form is input as a string. So when the data that we input into the form is passed to this page, it's going to be passed as a string. Well, it doesn't matter. I want to get those values, and I want to do something with them. Okay, but first of all, when I get the values, what I want to do is I want to assign them to some variables, so to some string variables. So that's what I'm going to do in my Java code here. I'm going to declare a string variable named first name. And what it's going to be equal to is one of the parameters in the request. So I'm calling, there's a method, getParameter, that I can call on the request that's being made to this page, but I have to specify to that method, getParameter, what value do you want to get? Which parameter value do you want to get? Well, I want to get the first parameter value. How do I know to use the word first here? Because that's what the element in the form was named, first. Okay? I want to get the value that was input into this first input element. Then I want to get the value that was input into the last input element. I want to get the value that was input into the email input element, into the gender drop-down selection list, and into the date of birth input element. Okay, so if I go back to the display.jsp up into my Java code, I'm going to do the same exact thing now for each of those other parameters. For last, for email, for gender, and for date of birth. So I'm going to set up 5 strings here. The next one's going to be for last name, and it's going to be equal to request.getParameter last. Next line of code, I'm going to set up a string for the email address, and it's going to be equal to request.getParameter email. Do that 2 more times. Next time for the gender, it's going to be equal to request.getParameter and the gender. And then the last one is going to be date of birth, and it's going to be equal to request.getParameter. I didn't spell that correctly. Request.getParameter, and then the date of birth So in my Java code, I've set up 5 variables, 5 string variables for each of the input elements on the form. And what I'm doing is I'm calling the get parameter method on the request that's issued to this JSP, and I'm saying get the value in the first parameter, in the last parameter, in the email parameter that was sent to the page, to the gender parameter, and to the date of birth parameter. So I've got all these values as strings now. I want to do something with them. Well, what do I want to do? I want to display them in this page. And I'm going to display them in a table. So the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag over a table underneath of my JSP element. It's going to have 5 rows, 2 columns. This time I am going to specify a border size. I want the border size to be 1. Push on OK, and there's my table. As I always do, I'm going to remove the table heading element from the table. I don't use it. Okay. But then what I'm going to do, within the rows of my tables, I'm going to display all of the values that are in these strings that I just set up. First row, I'm going to display the first name. And to actually display the value in the variable, I have to include that within a JSP element. Okay, so I'm going to display the value in the first name variable. Then in the second row, I'm going to do the same thing for the last name. Okay, so I'm just going to copy and paste this code and change it slightly. I'm going to display the last name. In the third row, I want to display, and it's complaining at me, it says it cannot find variable last name, and I think this is just another one of those, I don't know why it happens, type error. Let me copy and paste. Maybe the error will go away. Yeah, there it goes. In the third row, I want to display the email address. Okay. So I'm going to copy and paste the code down and change the variable name so that it references my email address variable. In the fourth row, I'm going to display the gender. Here I'm going to display the gender variable, the value in the gender variable. And in the last row of the table, I'm going to display the date of birth. So I'm going to display the value that's in my date of birth variable. Okay? So there's my second JSP, display.jsp, and this one contains now a mixture of Java code inside of a JSP element and pure HTML. Here's the pure HTML, here's the Java code. Okay, HTML, Java code. Okay, so let's compile this file now. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the index.jsp again. I'm going to run that file. So it's going to start up, and this time I'm going to input some values into the fields in the form. And when I push on submit, I'm going to issue a request to the display.jsp page. Hopefully, if all works well, we're going to read in these parameter values that are passed to it and display them in a table. Okay, so let's push on submit. And it worked. We didn't get the error. The display.jsp has been created. We issued a request to it. We passed values to it, and we displayed those values in a table. Okay, so now the interesting thing again, I like to come full circle. We can come back into NetBeans, and we can view the servlet code for our display.jsp. Let's view the servlet. Okay, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit. There are all the out.write statements for the HTML. There's the Java code. Okay, down below, here's some more out.write statements for the HTML to output the HTML. Okay, so there's a mixture of out.write statements. This is the Java servlet that's going to be executed by the servlet engine after it gets compiled. Okay, and we can view the source from this web page, from this page, and this is what the servlet generates. This static HTML is what that servlet generates. Okay, you can see it's static HTML. You don't see any of the Java code. You don't see any of the JSP elements. All you see is the static HTML, which gets rendered by the web browser in this form.